Good evening. If you haven't already taken a look at your cell phone and silenced it, now would be a great time. Thank you. Got a few people coming in here. Welcome. It's a joy to have you with us this evening. This is the third and final lecture in this year's Canon Jean Hansen Lectureship. It's really been just an absolute joy to have Christine sharing with us on Dorothy Sayers and doing it so engagingly. And she's one of our authors, I think, that is too little known. And there's so much there. I hope this has encouraged you to at least pick up a book or come to our reading room and take a look at some of. She's so prolific, and there's so many different diverse types of ways that you can get into reading Dorothy Sayers. And this evening, Christine will be speaking on Dorothy L. Sayers' vision for communities of joy, and that sounds like a good subject for the middle of Lent, doesn't it? Or the end of Lent, really, almost. And the whole series for this year has been Community or Chaos, Searching for Clues in the Works of Dorothy L. Sayers. It's fun to be able to announce that Christine has a new book that was published in the UK in December, I believe, and soon to be out in this country. And the title is Writing for the Masses, Dorothy L. Sayers in the Victorian Literary Tradition. So if you're intrigued, there are flyers at the front desk, the front reception desk of the Wade. Take a look at it. And we, of course, will have copies here in the reading room, so you can come and take a look at it there as well. So Christine writes as delightfully as she speaks, so you have a treasure in store if you pick that up. So before Christine comes and speaks to us this evening, it's a special pleasure to invite Dr. David McNutt to open in prayer. David is associate editor at InterVarsity Press Academic, and as some of you know, that is we have partnered with IVP Academic for the Hansen Lectureship books that are published. So it won't be this next year, but in 2 years, Christine's lectures on Dorothy L. Sayers will be available. But next fall, Tim Larson's series on George MacDonald will be our fall release book in this series. So David is just one of the most skilled editors and a gifted teacher and speaker as well. So David, thank you for coming tonight. Please join me in welcoming David McNutt.
Thank you, Marge. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. As Marge said, I serve as an academic editor at IVP Academic, and I do many things in that role. One of the things that I get to do is work on the Hansen Lectureship series. Of course, I love all of my projects equally, but I have a special place in my heart for this partnership with the Wade Center and with the Hansen Lectureship series. So as Marge said, we've already published the first series of lectures by Dr. Ryken. Dr. Larson's lectures on George MacDonald and the Age of Miracles will be out this fall, and we're looking forward to publishing Christine's series of lectures as well. So I'm mindful of the fact that I'm supposed to be standing in the place of Walter Hansen, which are some very large shoes to fill. And so I've enlisted some aid in that. And so I wanted to lead us just in a word of prayer. And I want to do so by reading a prayer from St. Patrick. I am mindful of the fact, as has already been mentioned, that we are in the season of Lent. And as we consider the various communities that Dorothy Sayers was a part of, I thought it might be appropriate for us to pray with the community of saints. And this is a prayer for the fourth Sunday in Lent, but I think it will work for a Thursday evening as well. So do pray with me. Permit us not, O Lord, to hear your word in vain. Convince us of its truth. Cause us to feel its power and bind us to yourself with cords of faith and hope and love that never shall be broken. We bind to ourselves today you, O God, your power to hold us, your hand to guide us, your eye to watch us, your ear to hear us, your wisdom to teach us, your word to give us speech, your presence to defend us this day and every day. In the name of the Blessed Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, to whom be the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Thank you.
Good evening. I would like to begin tonight's talk by taking just a little time to reflect back on my previous 2 lectures. Those of you who have been here for one or both of my earlier lectures on Dorothy Sayers' vision for community may have been left with the impression that for Sayers, maintaining a good, strong Christian community is exhausting. In the first lecture, I used the image of change ringing from Sayers' novel, The Nine Tailors, to discuss her vision for communities of action, communities where individuals find their particular vocations and then work diligently in harmony with others to help transform the world. Change ringing, which requires not only the physical stamina to pull a heavy church bell for long periods of time, but also the mental stamina to keep track of the intricate patterns that make up each peal, seemed an apt image for the intensity with which Sayers approached the importance of good work within community. In the second lecture, I used the image of an arch from Sayers' play The Zeal of Thy House to illustrate her vision for communities of faith, communities that she believes should be held together first by the keystone of correct doctrine, and second, by individuals sharing the burdens of others as they act as stones within the arch. Without these 2 components, which Sayers believes become linked through Christ's atonement, the arch of the community is doomed to fall. So as we look at these images side by side, we get a sense of how daunting the task of maintaining strong Christian community can seem, for the work involved seems almost impossible. Sayers herself was no stranger to hard work. She would regularly juggle multiple projects, and she always fully committed herself to doing whatever was necessary to complete those projects successfully, even if it meant occasionally stepping out of her expertise, such as when she helped to construct costumes or props for her plays. Sayers' life, however, was not one of drudgery, where she diligently, but perhaps a little resentfully, did her duty. Sayers' life was characterized by joy, and it was the type of joy that often overflowed into silliness and fun. As Nora Lambourne, the costume designer for several of Sayers' plays, recounts, Sayers' presence was always welcome in the workroom, especially at times of crisis or near panic, when she would always say the right thing to make everyone laugh and relax. For Sayers, joy is just as vital a component for good, strong community as hard work and true faith. So for this final talk, I would like to focus on this quality of joy, first by exploring how it manifested itself in Sayers' own life as she interacted with various communities, and second, by turning to her detective novels to see how Sayers illustrates this important connection between joy and community through the way that she develops the character of Harriet Vane. So let's begin with community in Sayers' own life. In an essay entitled Generosity and Courtesy, Dorothy L. Sayers as Friend, our own Marge Mead references an early poem by Sayers entitled Hymn in Contemplation of Sudden Death. Okay, I know from that title it doesn't sound like it's going to be joyful, but give me a minute, it'll get joyful. In this poem, Sayers thanks God for the various blessings in her life. She begins with her friends. Lord, if this night my journey end, I thank thee first for many a friend, the sturdy and unquestioned peers that run beneath my bridge of years. As Marge states in her essay, friends were not a luxury in Sayers' life, enjoyed but not essential. Rather, friends were foundational, as necessary to Sayers as the very air she breathed. Sayers loved being in community, and she devoted a significant amount of time to developing and maintaining strong friendships. And if you ever have time to read through some of the many letters that we have here at the Wade Center, you'll discover that one very important component in many of her friendships was a sense of joy. Not only would Sayers cheerfully engage her friends and family with in-depth discussions of their mutual interests, but she might also include a silly story or a fanciful illustration designed solely to make the recipient of her letter laugh. A sketch of a relative being dragged off to the insane asylum after being asked too many questions from her young son. Or a series of drawings showing where her cat's latest progeny had ended up. Okay, and kittens are a running theme because she's continually trying to give away her kittens to her friends. As Nora Lamburn remarked, Dorothy was a superb letter writer. One always opened one of her letters in joyful anticipation of the contents. Sayers' correspondence with C.S. Lewis is characteristic of the way that she developed and maintained friendships through her joyful letters. Many of the letters address serious topics, such as Sayers' translation of Dante, or a volume of essays that was being published as a tribute to their mutual friend Charles Williams, or even Lewis's grief over his wife's illness. But much of the correspondence is silly and humorous, such as the sketch of a dog that Sayers included in a letter where she complains about being pestered to death by a correspondent. Or we also have Sayers' response to Lewis when she discovers that his stepsons have pet mice and are therefore not interested in receiving one of her kittens. She complains, "The domestic factory goes on churning out kittens, but there, what's the good of talking? Obviously, I cannot work any kittens off on you. Never mind, we all have our troubles." My favorite exchange, though, is one in which Sayers tells Lewis about her newly acquired chickens, which she has decided to name after characters in a novel by Jane Austen. I have no news, except that, looking forward to the confidently expected food crisis, I have purchased 2 hens. In their habits, they display, respectively, sense and sensibility. And I have therefore named them Eleanor and Marianne. Eleanor is a round, comfortable, motherly-looking little body who lays 1 steady, regular, undistinguished egg per day and allows nothing to disturb her equanimity. Marianne is leggier, timid, and liable to hysterics. Sometimes she lays a shell-less egg, sometimes a double yolk, sometimes no egg at all. On the days when she lays no egg, she nevertheless goes and sits on the nest for the usual time and seems to imagine that nothing more is required. As my gardener says, she just thinks she's laid an egg. Too much imagination, in fact, sensibility. But when she does lay an egg, it is larger than Eleanor's. But you cannot wish to listen to this cackle. Lewis did, however, wish to listen to this cackle, for he responds, "I loved hearing about Eleanor and Marianne. You are a real letter writer." Sayers' correspondence with Lewis, as well as with many of her friends, reveals the joy that she experienced in her friendships, a joy that was, in fact, an integral part of her personality. Significantly, as Sayers continues her hymn in contemplation of sudden death, she thanks God not only for her friends, but also for the power thou gavest me to view the whole world mirthfully, for laughter, paraclete of pain, like April suns across the rain. Sayers was only 22 years old when she published this poem. And in the subsequent years of her life, she experienced many trials and heartaches that she probably never imagined when she wrote the poem. Through them all, however, Sayers maintained both her deep commitment to her friends and her ability to view the whole world mirthfully. She approached life with exuberant joy and used that joy not only to help draw together a host of faithful friends, but also to build and maintain various communities that provided her with the emotional and intellectual support that she, as well as others in the community, needed to create excellent work. Sayers discovered early in her life that she flourished within community. As Barbara Reynolds relates, Sayers' best experiences as a student at Oxford were the joy of comradeship in organizing and acting a play, the glory of singing with the Bach choir, and the creative stimulus of exchanging and discussing poetry with fellow enthusiasts. Here, Sayers also discovered that she had a masterful ability to pull a community together through sheer silliness, an ability that is illustrated well by this photo, in which we see Sayers dressed as Hugh Allen, the director of the Bach choir, as she participates in a play with some of her friends. Sayers was generally willing to dress up for a good cause, and this served her well a number of years later when she became one of the founding members of the Detection Club. This club, which is still in existence today, was designed to bring writers of detective fiction together, not only to socialize, but also to talk shop and hone their craft. But from the beginning, this community was also held together by a bit of silliness, as all new members were required to participate in an elaborate initiation ceremony. The current Detection Club president, Martin Edwards, vividly describes what one of these ceremonies, the installation of a new president, looked like from the perspective of a visitor. All of a sudden, the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. Without warning, a door swung open. The orator had arrived. Resplendent in scarlet and black robes and wearing pince-nez, a statuesque woman entered the room. She marched towards the lectern, holding a single taper to light the way. Stern and purposeful, the orator lit a candle. At her command, a somber procession of men and women in evening dress filed into the room. 4 members of the group carried flaming torches. Others clutched lethal weapons, a rope, a blunt instrument, a sword, a vial of poison. A giant of a man brought up the rear. On the cushion that he carried, beneath a black cloth, squatted a grinning human skull. The orator cleared her throat and began to speak. She administered a lengthy oath to a burly man in his 60s. As the ritual approached its end, the orator lifted her revolver. Giving a faint smile, she fired a single shot. In the enclosed space, the noise was deafening. Her colleagues let out blood-curdling cries and waved their weapons in the air. The eyes of the skull lit up the blackness, shining with a fierce red glow. So, if you haven't guessed already, the orator in this ceremony was Dorothy Sayers. Whether she was impersonating her choir director or orchestrating the dramatic initiation rites of the Detection Club, Sayers fully committed herself to the silliness of it all, embracing the joy of comradeship in these communities of friends. Sayers, in fact, repeatedly gravitated towards communities that combined the seriousness of hard work with the fun of celebrating together. Communities that seemed to become even more important in the years following World War I. As Martin Edwards argues, the Detection Club arose at a time when many other groups also began to devote themselves to fun and silliness. For after the loss of millions of lives in combat, and then during the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, games offered escape from the horrors of wartime, as well as from the bleak realities of peace. The Detection Club offered a place where these writers could come together to escape the challenges of their own lives and to share ideas about the works that they were creating, works that would in fact help their readers escape as well. As a writer of detective fiction, Sayers was quite serious about studying her craft and working to develop the genre so that the novels would be more than just intricate puzzles. But she also recognized the simple fun of escapism involved in the stories, and she never took herself or her works too seriously. She even admonished some of her critics for their inability to have fun with her stories, stating, "These people all sound so cross, as if they wore frightfully scratchy woolies and were in a perpetual state of suppressed irritation. I think there is somewhere in them a strong puritanical strain which is fretted by the sight of people enjoying themselves. Go and see what the children are doing and tell them to stop it at once." That kind of attitude must issue in aridity, don't you think? Fertility does call for a certain careless zest and exuberance, and a willingness to rejoice with them that do rejoice. Sayers certainly had that exuberance and willingness to rejoice with them that do rejoice in her own life, and she was generally happy to cultivate it in her readers as well, as she built up her community of loyal fans. With the outbreak of World War II, Sayers did start to have some misgivings about the escapism of detective fiction that she expresses in The Mind of the Maker when she warns her readers that they can't treat the complex problems of real life like the simple problems found in detective stories. But that didn't keep her from publishing letters from various characters from her novels during the war to keep up morale, nor did it stop her from continuing to have fun with her detective, Lord Peter Wimsey, even after she stopped writing detective stories. For she and her friends would regularly write spoof pamphlets about the supposedly historical Wimsey family and all of their illustrious connections. Sayers fully understood the necessity of addressing the real problems of her society, and she did so in many of her essays. But she also recognized the importance of fun and joy, both as a way to survive in the midst of the challenges of life and as a way to build community with other like-minded people. Sayers also believed that fun could be a powerful way to help the public engage with more serious issues. And in her later detective novels, such as Gaudy Night, the mysteries are intertwined with important themes, such as the value of maintaining integrity in the work a person feels called to do. But it is truly with her work on Dante that Sayers fully embraced the challenge of combining a sense of fun with deep Christian truth. Sayers began reading Dante in an air raid shelter in 1944, and she was immediately captivated. She expresses her initial excitement about Dante in a letter to Charles Williams, declaring, "I was prepared to find him a great poet, and of course a great religious poet, all in solemn capital letters. But I was not prepared to find him good company. And I was certainly not prepared to find myself continually saying with a chuckle, 'Dear funny Dante.'" Sayers had expected to find profound theological reflection in his works, but she had not expected to find it conveyed with such humor. She had found a kindred spirit in the writer that she dubbed the supreme poet of joy. So she eagerly entered into the challenge of translating the Divine Comedy for modern readers. Sayers was convinced that Dante's portrayal of sin and salvation was precisely what an audience needed to read in the years following World War II as they attempted to rebuild their society. And she believed that she could draw them into his seemingly complex poetry by conveying its energy and humor in a new translation. She declares, "If we know how to read the Divine Comedy, we shall find that it has an enormous relevance both to us as individuals and to the world situation today." And for Sayers, part of knowing how to read Dante properly meant being able to experience his humor, which she believed had been hopelessly obscured by his translators and critics. She, in fact, compares Dante to Jane Austen and says that they both have the same sense of humor. Sayers' newly discovered love of Dante brought her, at the end of her life, into a new community with Charles Williams, Barbara Reynolds, and other Dante scholars and students. And through her translation, she worked to bring the common reader into that community as well, not only so that they would enjoy the Divine Comedy, but also so that they would learn from Dante's wisdom. Throughout her life, Sayers placed herself in communities of kindred spirits who combined the hard work of writing with joy, a stance that seemed particularly necessary in the years when her society was recovering first from World War I and then from World War II. This stance was also necessary for Sayers herself, as she struggled with the various challenges that arose in her personal life. God may have given Sayers the ability to view the whole world mirthfully, but he didn't exempt her from the difficulties of life, the trials of finding a job that would pay the rent, the pain of several difficult relationships, and the challenge of supporting a son who was born outside of marriage. As a Christian, Sayers knew the power of God's love and forgiveness, but she still experienced many trials in her life. And as Barbara Reynolds recounts in her biography, Sayers struggled at times to find a way out of depression and back into community, as well as into joy. When we turn to Sayers' detective novels, we can see a fictionalized version of this process. For with the character of Harriet Vane, who shares some important qualities with her creator, Sayers powerfully illustrates how difficult it may be not only to reconnect with community, but also to find joy within that community. Now, we must certainly not oversimplify the connection between Sayers and her character, for Harriet is not simply a fictionalized version of Sayers. They are, in fact, quite different in a number of ways. But the fact that Sayers creates Harriet as a writer of detective fiction gives her a tragic love affair that draws on aspects of Sayers' relationships and anchors her recovery firmly in the academic world of Oxford, which Sayers herself loved, suggests that Sayers may be using Harriet to explore this process of reconnecting with community and joy that proved to be so important in her own life. Harriet is first introduced in the novel Strong Poison. If you remember from my first lecture, this is the novel in which Sayers' detective, Lord Peter Wimsey, comes to value community as he relies on his friends and their expertise to help solve the murder and save Harriet, the woman he loves, from being executed for a crime she didn't commit. Interestingly, in her essay Gaudy Night, Sayers explains why she decided to bring a love interest into her detective series, despite having condemned that practice in earlier essays. She declares, "Let me confess that when I undertook Strong Poison, it was with the infanticidal intention of doing away with Peter. That is, of marrying him off and getting rid of him." Sayers, however, does not end the series with Strong Poison. She, in fact, writes 6 more novels featuring Peter. In fact, more novels after Strong Poison than before. And with 3 of them, she combines the detective story with the development of Peter and Harriet's relationship. She explains this decision by saying, I could not marry Peter off to the young woman he had rescued from death and infamy, because I could find no form of words in which she could accept him without loss of self-respect. Sayers, therefore, begins to develop both Peter and Harriet in her subsequent novels, rounding out Peter's character so that he could become more of a complete human being, and tracing Harriet's development as she recovers from the devastating experience of being on trial for murder. This process is a fascinating one, and a number of scholars have explored what Sayers is saying about love, integrity, marriage, and gender roles through her development of this relationship. But what I find particularly interesting is that Harriet grows not only in her ability to respect herself and admit her love for Peter, but also in her ability to enter into community and experience joy. The trajectory of the 4 novels that feature Harriet and Peter's relationship moves not only toward the joy of marriage, but also toward the joy of community, powerfully illustrating both the importance that Sayers placed on community and the essential quality of joy that she believes may be found within it. At the beginning of Strong Poison, Harriet is completely alienated from community. Our first glimpse of her comes as she stands alone, facing the judge who is summarizing the case against her. She is introduced only as the prisoner, whose eyes, like dark smudges under heavy square brows, seemed equally without fear and without hope. This sense of alienation and isolation is emphasized later when Peter visits Harriet in prison and is given the procedures he must follow during the visit. The warder explains, "You sit at one end and the prisoner at the other, and you must be careful not to move from your seats nor to pass any object over the table. I shall be outside and see you through the glass." As a prisoner, Harriet has lost the freedom to communicate freely with others and enter into community with them. And as much as Peter tries to break down that barrier in their meetings, he can never manage to truly connect with Harriet, who, while appreciating the work that he does to prove her innocence, repeatedly refuses to marry him. As Sayers illustrates, however, Harriet's feelings of alienation go much deeper than this. For Harriet had isolated herself from community even before she was accused of murdering her lover, Philip Boyes. As one of the witnesses relates during the trial, Harriet Vane obviously felt her unfortunate position of living with a man outside of marriage very acutely, cutting herself off from family friends and refusing to thrust herself into company where her social outlawry might cause embarrassment. Sayers emphasizes the depth of this isolation even further by revealing that even Bohemian London, the one community that does not condemn Harriet for her decision, is not a very welcoming place for her. While a couple of the women from the community support her during her trial, most are so consumed with their own lives that they can't be bothered to think about anyone else. And some are actively hostile, believing that Harriet murdered Boyes out of beastly spite and jealousy. And as if this isolation weren't bad enough, Sayers takes it one step further by revealing the loneliness that Harriet experienced even within her relationship with Boyes. For when Peter asks Harriet if she was friends with Boyes, she replies, "No." The word broke out with a kind of repressed savagery that startled him. Philip wasn't the sort of man to make a friend of a woman. Harriet's experience of being accused of murder certainly increases her sense of isolation. But as Sayers portrays it, the isolation began long before her arrest. And it has had a powerful effect on her. In one of the conversations that Sayers crafts between Peter and Harriet, she reveals just how damaged Harriet has been by her isolation. After Peter humorously recounts his feelings after a doomed love affair, they have the following exchange. "If anybody ever marries you, it will be for the pleasure of hearing you talk piffle," said Harriet severely. "A humiliating reason, but better than no reason at all." "I used to talk piffle rather well myself," said Harriet, with tears in her eyes, "but it's got knocked out of me. You know, I was really meant to be a cheerful person. All this gloom and suspicion isn't the real me, but I've lost my nerve somehow." Harriet's experiences have deadened her ability to enjoy the silly fun of talking piffle or nonsense. But even more than that, they've deadened her ability to experience the deeper joy of community that is built as friends engage in piffle. You can't talk piffle alone. You need friends not only to appreciate it, but also to respond in kind. As this novel concludes, the ramifications of Harriet's pain are clear, for she is unable to return to community. Upon her acquittal, she simply desires to get out of all of this and be left alone. Harriet wishes only for deeper isolation, And as Sayers demonstrates through the next 3 novels, Harriet's sense of joy and fun is restored not simply by eventually marrying Peter, but also by being integrated into strong communities. With Have His Carcass, Sayers begins to explore the complexities of Harriet's recovery. A recovery which, while it has its positives, a focus on honest work and physical activity, also has its negatives, a continuing isolation as she embarks on a solitary walking tour. Peter, in fact, diagnoses the essence of Harriet's struggle, declaring, "You don't want ever again to have to depend for happiness on another person." To which Harriet responds, "That's true. That's the truest thing you've ever said." Harriet fears entering into relationship with anyone, and Sayers highlights these fears with the setting that she creates for this mystery. The dead man that Harriet discovers on the beach during her walking tour turns out to be a dancer at the Respondent Hotel in the seaside resort of Wilvercombe. And as Harriet begins to investigate the case, she discovers the pathetic desperation that lies just beneath the surface of this community. Upon entering the ballroom of this hotel, Harriet notices the absurd roles that everyone is playing as the professional dancers try to attract the attention of the wealthy guests, and the guests try to relive their youth. She's particularly struck by a lean woman, pathetically made up, dressed in an exaggeration of the fashion which it would have been difficult for a girl of 19 to carry off successfully. As it turns out, this woman, Mrs. Weldon, is engaged to one of the dancers, Paul Alexis, who is, in fact, the man whose body Harriet discovered on the beach. With her desperate and rather ridiculous love for Paul, a young man who made his living by flattering older, wealthy women, Mrs. Weldon, like most of the members of this community, is caught up in an illusion of love, making this community particularly problematic for Harriet's recovery. Not only does it repeatedly remind Harriet of her own mistake of devoting herself to a man who didn't truly love her and whom she didn't love either, but it also increases her fears of entering into a relationship again. Sayers reveals these fears even more fully through the way that she develops Harriet and Peter's relationship in the novel. On the surface, they begin to develop rapport as they investigate the mystery together. But underneath, Harriet is still consumed with bitterness over her past and resentment against Peter. This becomes painfully clear in a scene where they initially seem to be caught up in the fun of figuring out the clues to the mystery. That mood is quickly broken when Harriet lists herself as one of the suspects and declares, "You thought I was pretty brazen when you found me getting publicity out of the thing, the murder. So I was. There's no choice for a person like me to be anything but brazen. But do you think it makes matters any more agreeable to know that it is only the patronage of Lord Peter Wimsey that prevent men like the inspector from being openly hostile? I suppose you think I haven't been humiliated enough already without this parade of chivalry." Harriet can't escape her notoriety. She resents being placed once again in the position of having to be grateful for Peter's assistance. And being continually reminded of the dangers of false community certainly does not help her move beyond their complicated past. The entire episode, in fact, makes them uncomfortable. At the end of the novel, Peter reflects, "Well, isn't that a damned awful, bitter, bloody farce? The old fool who wanted a lover and the young fool who wanted an empire. One throat cut and 3 people hanged. I always did hate watering places." Interestingly, Peter concludes by indicting not just the crime, but also the community. With this line, which is actually the final line of the novel, Sayers reminds her readers of the dangers that have flourished in the false community of this resort. And she sets the stage for a better type of community that she creates for Harriet in the next novel, Gaudy Night. For it is in that novel that Harriet begins to discover the real community that will eventually allow her to recover the sense of joy that has been lacking in both Strong Poison and Have His Carcass. In Gaudy Night, Sayers completes the process by which Harriet and Peter are finally able to come together. Harriet, by returning to Oxford to investigate a series of crimes at her old college, immerses herself in the integrity of the scholarly life and rediscovers her self-worth. And Peter develops the humility and vulnerability that allow Harriet to envision the possibility of an equal relationship with him. Their love story permeates the novel, but significantly, Peter and Harriet's union comes about only when they are immersed in the community of Oxford. which, while certainly not perfect, is revealed to be a far better community than the world of Bohemian London that we saw in Strong Poison, or the world of the Resplendent Hotel in Havis Carcass. With this novel, Sayers asks her readers to recognize that this joy becomes possible because the relationship is nurtured within the joy of the wider community of Oxford. Sayers emphasizes the importance of this communal sense of joy with the title of the novel. Gaudy comes from the Latin gaudium, which means joy or delight, and it is the name given to college reunions at Oxford, when the graduates return for a weekend to revel in the joys that they once experienced in the community of their college. The novel, in fact, begins with Harriet considering whether or not to return to Shrewsbury College for the Gaudy. A friend has asked her to attend, but she's hesitant to go. She reflects, "It was so long ago, so closely encompassed and complete, so cut off as by swords from the bitter years that lay between. Could one face it now? What would those women say to her, to Harriet Vane, who had taken her first in English and gone to London to write mystery fiction, to live with a man who was not married to her, and to be tried for his murder amid a roar of notoriety? That was not the kind of career that Shrewsbury expected of its old students." While several years have passed since her trial, Harriet's first impulse is still to isolate herself. She's afraid of how she'll be received by others and doesn't wish to tarnish her wonderful memories of college. She decides, however, to attend, and it's at the Gaudy that she receives a brief glimmer of the joy that she longs to recapture, a joy that comes, significantly, by being in community. As she listens to one of the speeches at the Gaudy dinner, she imagines that whole wildly heterogeneous, that even slightly absurd collection of chattering women fused into a corporate unity with one another, and with every man and woman to whom integrity of mind meant more than material gain. She then comes to the realization that, in the glamour of one gaudy night, one could realize that one was a citizen of no mean city. It might be an old and old-fashioned city with inconvenient buildings and narrow streets, but her foundations were set upon the holy hills, and her spires touched heaven. As she listens, Harriet begins to recognize in herself an integrity of mind that would enable her to transcend her past and enter again into this academic community. And by doing so, she begins the process of rediscovering her self-worth. This gaudy night, which Sayers emphasizes with her title, begins Harriet's quest to once again experience the joy of being part of community. Sayers continues to emphasize Harriet's quest for joy within community with the mystery that Harriet is tasked with solving. For Harriet's search for the poisoned pen writer who threatens the peace and security of Shrewsbury College repeatedly compels her to reflect on whether this academic community truly has the integrity and joy that she so desperately desires. Harriet loves the commitment to scholarly excellence that she sees in dons such as Miss Lydgate and Miss Devine, and she herself revels in it as she does her own research. Harriet also admires these women's compassion, seeing their care for others and experiencing their care herself, as the various dons provide her with counsel and support during her time in the college. Her joy of returning to the community, however, is tempered by the crimes that she observes. They cause her to question not only the individual women who make up the community, but also the entire premise of this secluded academic world. She reflects, "The warped and repressed mind is apt enough to turn and wound itself. Soured virginity, unnatural life, semi-demented spinsters, starved appetites and suppressed impulses, unwholesome atmosphere." She could think of a whole set of epithets ready minted for circulation. Was this what lived in the tower set on the hill? Harriet begins to wonder which one of the students or dons could be the warped mind behind the crimes, and she feels torn between her desire to enter into this quiet place where she may recover a sense of worth and integrity, and her fears that the community will disappoint her. With the conclusion of the mystery, in which Peter is able to prove that the acts were not committed by either students or the dons, Sayers once again affirms the value of this community. As Harriet reflects, "They were all normal again. They had never been anything else. Now that the distorting glass of suspicion was removed, they were kindly, intelligent human beings, as understandable and pleasant as daily bread." These women are not perfect by any means. As Janice Brown, in her studies of the novel, remarks, There's a continual smoldering of petty jealousy and unpleasant competitiveness among the Dons. But as Brown also acknowledges, there's a brilliant intellect and noble characters. There is depth of sensitivity and compassion. At the end of the novel, Shrewsbury College has become a model of the type of community that Sayers values, a community where everyone is committed not only to the integrity of her work, but also to the support of the other members. And by immersing herself in this community, Harriet is finally able to recover from her past trauma, regain the integrity that she had felt she had lost, and experience the joy of being in a community of friends. Sayers continues to emphasize the importance of this community by the way that she finally brings Harriet and Peter together. Harriet initially worries that by asking for Peter's help with the mystery, she had called in something explosive from the outside world to break up the ordered tranquility of the place. But she soon realizes almost immediately that the image had been a false one. Peter came into the quiet room as though he belonged there and had never belonged to any other place. Like Harriet, Peter, as a graduate of Balliol College, returns to Oxford as part of the community. And he values it for exactly the same reasons that Harriet does. He tells her, "Here's where the real things are done. If only one could root oneself in here among the grass and stones and do something worth doing." For the first time, Harriet realizes that she and Peter, who because of class differences and the scandal of her trial have seemed to exist in two entirely different realms, can actually be part of the same community. Peter recognizes it as well. As they stand together on the Radcliffe camera surveying the towers of the various colleges, he tells her, "I set out in a lordly manner to offer you heaven and earth. I find that all I have to give you is Oxford, which was yours already." The joy that Peter and Harriet experience as Harriet finally accepts Peter's proposal is fully immersed in the joy that both have already experienced within the community of Oxford, for it is their commitment to the integrity of this community that finally allows them to come together as equals. Sayers powerfully illustrates how firmly embedded this relationship is in the community of Oxford by the way that she orchestrates the scene in which Harriet finally agrees to marry Peter. In this scene, both are dressed in academic robes, and Peter's proposal follows the form used in Oxford to confirm academic degrees. He asks in Latin, untranslated in the novel, by the way, but in Latin, "Does it please thee, mistress?" And she replies, "It pleases." While the passing proctor is scandalized to see senior members of the university passionately embracing in New College Lane, readers are not as scandalized. It seems entirely appropriate that this moment of joy for Peter and Harriet is wrapped up in their identities as members of the university. For as Sayers has revealed throughout the novel, this Gaudy Night has become possible because of the initial Gaudy Night that helped Harriet begin to reconnect with the community of Oxford. Ultimately, Harriet's joy in this academic community enables the healing that allows her to commit to this relationship with Peter. In her final novel, Busman's Honeymoon, Sayers continues to emphasize the importance of this sense of joy and community as she explores the early days of Peter and Harriet's marriage. In this novel, Sayers presents the couple with a number of challenges to their relationship that they must negotiate as they investigate the murder of a man found in the basement of their new home. Not exactly how you want to start your marriage. By concluding the novel with a selection from John Donne's poem, Eclogue for the Marriage of the Earl of Somerset, Sayers suggests that, by the end, they are able to achieve joy's bonfire, where love's strong arts make of so noble individual parts one fire of four inflaming eyes and of two loving hearts. The focus of this novel is truly on the development of their relationship that leads them to this joy's bonfire. But once again, Sayers positions that joy within the context of the wider communities that Harriet is finally willing to enter into, showing just how far she has developed from the point of strong poison. Sayers highlights the importance of community right from the beginning, for the novel opens not with Peter and Harriet's reflections on their marriage, but rather with comments from other members of their community. Through this, Sayers draws attention to the people who surround and support Peter and Harriet in their marriage. She does this most clearly through Helen, Peter's sister-in-law, who strongly conveys her distaste for the odd assortment of people who attend the wedding. Helen recounts that Harriet is married from a woman's college and is attended by the most incredible assortment of bridesmaids, all female dons, and an odd, dark woman who gave her away who was supposed to be the head of the college. And Peter has gathered all kinds of queer people in the church, that ridiculous old Clemson woman, and some hangers-on that he had picked up in the course of his cases, and several policemen. There is even a man in a Salvation Army uniform who was a retired burglar. While Helen is appalled, readers recognize how appropriate it is for Harriet and Peter to be married, surrounded by their unique assortment of friends. For as Sayers reminds us, Harriet and Peter are not simply marrying each other, they are entering into each other's communities. Sayers intensifies this focus on community for Harriet with her choice of a honeymoon destination. To evade the prying eyes of the press, Peter and Harriet escape to the home that they recently purchased in the small rural community where Harriet grew up. For Harriet, the woman who cut herself off entirely from her previous life when she lived with boys, the decision to return to this community is significant, for she is essentially returning home, embracing it as the place where she wishes to begin her married life. And she makes no secret of her connection, introducing herself as Dr. Vane's daughter, who used to live at Great Pagford. Now that she is rooted in the community created by her marriage, she also wishes to reconnect with the community of her childhood. And just as she discovered with the academic community of Oxford, Peter fits perfectly within this community as well. As Harriet watches Peter interact with the vicar, she reflects, Peter belonged to an ordered society, and this was it. More than any of the friends of her own world, he spoke the familiar language of her childhood. To emphasize this point, Sayers has Peter, responding to the vicar's invitation to a concert, break into song, to be joined first by Harriet, then by Mr. Puffett, the chimney sweep, Mr. Goodacre, the vicar, and Miss Twitterton, the church organist. By having this odd assortment of characters come together quite literally in harmony, Sayers not only illustrates the ease with which both Peter and Harriet enter into this world, but also reveals just how much Harriet has changed over the course of the novels. We finally see her happy and truly at ease as she returns to her childhood community. She is even able to engage in piffle, as she, Peter, and the superintendent repeatedly trade literary quotations during the investigation. Significantly, it is from this position that Sayers then allows Harriet to help Peter through his own crisis as he begins to isolate himself in response to the repercussions of his investigation. As readers of the series know, Peter often struggles intensely at the conclusion of his cases as he grapples with the realities of what he has done. As his mother describes it, he doesn't like responsibility, you know. The war and one thing and another was bad for people that way. While Peter can hold to his belief in the integrity of his job during the investigation, he has difficulty seeing its value once someone is sentenced to death based on his information. And he worries that he inevitably ends up injuring the community that he was trying to help. At the conclusion of Busman's honeymoon, Peter retreats further and further into himself as the time of the execution draws near, and Harriet wonders if he will choose to simply disappear, as he has in the past. Eventually, Peter does return home to wait out the long hours before the execution with Harriet. And it is here that Harriet helps Peter realize the value of his work in the wider community, so that he may once again become part of it. As they discuss Peter's fears about the damage that he has done with the investigation, Harriet reminds him that it is his commitment to integrity that has enabled him not only to purge evil from the community, but also to protect the innocent. She tells him, if you hadn't meddled, it might have been Joe Sellon or Aggie Twitterton facing execution. If you hadn't meddled 6 years ago, it would almost certainly have been me. Harriet, who was drawn back into the community of Oxford by focusing on the integrity of her own work, comforts her husband with the same idea, helping him to recover from his own fears and isolation, so that they may finally reach the joyous bonfire of marriage described in the John Donne poem. Sayers, however, doesn't leave the story there. For in her short story, Tall Boys, she reveals that this healing has implications not simply for Peter and Harriet's marriage, but also for their connection to community. In this story, we get a glimpse of the Whimsies just a few years later, and they are firmly and happily rooted back in this community where they have chosen to rear their 3 sons. This image is an important one, For with the trajectory of her works, Sayers does far more than simply trace the development of Peter and Harriet's relationship. She embeds it in Harriet's difficult but necessary journey of reconnecting with community and rediscovering joy, a process that Sayers emphasizes by showing how it enables Harriet not only to recover from her own grief and isolation, but also to help her husband recover from his. By the end of the series, Harriet recovers her sense of joy, and she becomes the cheerful person that she was meant to be. And her process, which was so powerfully affected by the joy that she experienced in the intellectual integrity of the academic community of Oxford, is one that certainly resonates with Sayers' own life. Sayers, however, ultimately has an even deeper source for her joy in community than Harriet does. At the conclusion of Busman's honeymoon, Harriet's hope rests primarily on her integrity of mind and on Peter's, as she reminds him of all the individuals and communities that he has helped restore through his investigations. Readers familiar with the entire series, however, may realize that this integrity of mind doesn't always result in joyful community. For in some cases, like those in the novels Unnatural Death and The Nine Tailors, Peter's investigations have had negative repercussions on innocent people and on their communities. While integrity of mind may be an important component within community, Sayers recognizes that it may not be the strongest foundation for it. And it is here, as I conclude, that I must return to a few ideas that I explored in my first two talks, which give us a clearer sense of where Sayers' foundation for joy in community actually lies. As I mentioned in my first lecture, Sayers, at the conclusion of Nine Tailors, provides Peter with a much stronger foundation for hope, in the words of the Reverend Venables, who responds to Peter's distress over his investigation by remarking, "My dear boy, it does not do for us to take too much thought for the morrow. It is better to follow the truth and leave the result in the hand of God. He can foresee where we cannot, because he knows all the facts." While Sayers, like Harriet, is fully committed to truth and integrity of mind, she also believes, like Venables, that God is the only one who can ultimately bring order to the seeming chaos. This reliance on God is essential, for as I explored in my second talk, Sayers recognizes that we as individuals are inevitably flawed. As she illustrates in her play The Zeal of Thy House with the character of William of Sens, Sayers knows that even our best attempts to work with integrity are never perfect. Sayers has confidence, though, that God has the power not only to purify our motives and perfect our work, but also to bring us back into community. For Sayers, then, joy in community is ultimately possible not because we can see how everything has worked out in the past, but rather because we can trust that God will fulfill his perfect work in the future, even as he works with flawed individuals and flawed communities. With this deep foundation for her hope, Sayers herself was able to fully experience the joy that comes both from seeing the world mirthfully and from sharing that mirth with good friends. As Barbara Reynolds states, gaudium, elation of the soul, was a virtue Sayers did not find it difficult to practice. Sayers found joy in being part of communities of action and doing the good, hard work that she felt called to do. She found joy in being part of a community of faith as she worked to uphold the truths of Christianity while also supporting the good work of her Christian friends and colleagues. And she found joy in her day-to-day interaction with friends as she built relationships based not only on shared interests and deep truth, but also on silly stories about her chickens. Sayers fully embraced the command in Philippians 4:4 to rejoice in the Lord always, and she encouraged her community of friends, as well as her community of readers, to do so also. Thank you.
Well, Christine, another wonderful pulling together of us into a community of Dorothy Sayers, and I hope you continue to stay a part of that and read and expand, but it was, we're sorry that this is the last one, so we know it won't be the last that you have to say on Sayers, though. Thank you, Christine. And one of the great joys of the Hansen Lectureship series is the fact that we can bring together a different type of community on campus by bringing people from other departments. And we've done that through the faculty respondents as well as through the main lecturers. And tonight it's a special joy to have with us Dr. Bryan McGraw, who is department chair and associate professor of politics at Wheaton. And Dr. McGraw is the author of Faith in Politics, published by Cambridge University Press. And his academic interests include, among other things, pluralism, law and religion, and political theory. So please join me in welcoming Dr. McGraw in his response.
So my thanks to the Wade Center and to Christine Colón for an excellent set of lectures this year, and especially for the opportunity to respond to this last one on the occasion of the relationship between joy and community. It is worth noting, though, that you might discover at the end of these few minutes that you've made a terrible mistake. 3 of them, actually. First, I'm no literary scholar. Indeed, I only began reading Dorothy Sayers when I arrived here at Wheaton 10 years ago. In the parlance of our age, I am a noob. Secondly, I am hardly known as a joyous person. Indeed, I have long attempted to cultivate a bit of a curmudgeonly reputation, at least among my students and my children. And here, at least, I've had some stunning successes, I think. Third, and a little bit more seriously, though, I am by vocation a political theorist. And since I am that, I'm always and everywhere inclined to view things in relation to the relatively jaundiced world of politics. That is, you have invited into your midst an all too often grumpy immature whose instincts are to relate everything to politics. If you want help in viewing the world mirthfully, I may not be much help. And yet, when Professor Colón sent me the text of her talk, I was thrilled. When I discovered the series of detective novels centered on Lord, Peter, Death, Bread, and Whimsy, I devoured them one after another precisely because they indeed were so joyous. Consider, if you will, P.D. James's mystery novels as an interesting contrast. Her most famous character, Adam Dalglish, is like Peter, a master detective, and a master of arcane knowledge, especially in his case of the visual arts. But his life is a gloomy struggle. He is, sometimes I've thought, a personification of post-Christian Britain, resplendent with treasures from ages past, still learned, still committed to its duties, and yet slowly dying inside. Not so with Lord Peter. His humor, excitement, love, exuberance, and joy radiate throughout every story. There's also some deep sadness, more on that in a second. But no one reading these novels could miss what a singularly and profoundly joyful character he is. So I hope this evening to follow Professor Colón's lead and spend just a bit of time reflecting on the relationship between joy and community as exhibited in some of the detective fiction. Of course, because I am a political theorist, I can't help but ask about the place of joy in the distinctively political community, as over other sorts of communities like churches, theater troupes, or detection societies. Really should have one of those at Wheaton, I think. Does the business of legislation, judging, elections, backroom deals, and violence have a place for joy? Our day, perhaps like many others, evinces little, if any, joy in our politics. We are more apt to suppose that politics requires struggle, calculation, passion, anger, and conflict, or maybe it requires, as the philosophers sometimes pretend, just better rational deliberation. But joy? Hardly. I think there's inevitably some truth to this commonplace, for political communities are indeed substantively different than other sorts of communities, and thus ask different things of us. To suppose that the sort of joy that can inhabit a marriage or a church or a theater troupe can or should inhabit also a political community is probably a mistake. Politics is, to my mind, too tied up with the tragic to ever be constituted by joy in the same way as, say, a marriage might be. But we need not despair. Indeed, we should not despair. For while political communities can't have joy exactly, I think, they might be able to grasp hope, perhaps joy's first cousin. This would not be the sort of cheap hope packaged by hucksters and utopians alike, but rather hard-won trust grounded in faith and fully aware of its tragic limits. As much as Sayers provokes us to view the world mirthfully, in both Peter's exuberance and Harriet's redemption, Professor Colón calls our attention, perhaps, to joy's limits in the context of that community whose intractable characteristic this side of the eschaton is in dealing out death. We cannot do without joy. But as Peter in particular shows us, politics, also necessary for our flourishing, carries tragedy in its wake, no matter what those hucksters or utopians may suppose. We should refuse the double temptation, on the one hand, to eschew the tragic and ignore joy's limits, and on the other, to make it all politics and lose joy and hope altogether. Or so it seems to me. So I'll confess that one of the best things about Professor Colón's paper is that it redeems for this reader the character of Harriet Vane, who quite honestly had been my least favorite of the characters connected to Peter Wimsey. Her unwillingness to extend to Peter much in the way of any kind of gratitude for saving her life in strong poison had always bothered me. Her persistent brush off had struck me as odd and frankly made me dislike her so much that I was even a bit disappointed when I realized that Peter was in love with her and they were headed to marriage. I probably also suspected the series was ending too. That was sad. Professor Colón shows us, however, how Vane's character reveals something important for us, namely the interrelation of joy and community. When we first meet Harriet, of course, she's both alone and joyless. It's hard to imagine someone of her class being more alone, ostracized for an illicit relationship with Philip Boyes and in prison accused of his murder. Bereft of friends, she cannot even seemingly lean on a memory of her relationship with Boyes to sustain her. She is utterly alone, and the idea of seeing the world mirthfully seems utterly impossible. It's easy to see why Harriet, with her lover dead and her own life on the line, would be a bit on the sad side. But even after she's exonerated, she exhibits no joy. She can't even manage relief or gratitude, really. It's only with the discovery of good community, first at Oxford and then with Peter, that joy returns. Why? Well, Professor Colón reads Sayers, rightly I think, as suggesting these are places where she comes to be supported and valued, where she can do good work, both scholarly and detective work. It is only in good community, we might say, that Harriet Vane begins to reacquire self-respect. Her sense that she genuinely belongs is not just an object of condemnation or curiosity or pity. That all seems right. We can't flourish as human beings, and surely joy is a part of human flourishing, outside of our belonging to good communities, places we are known and valued. This is a lesson, I think, that we, late moderns or maybe postmoderns, have forgotten or missed. I'll not bore you with another Jeremiad against individualism. The ubiquity of such calls, especially among Christians, I think merely demonstrates its power. But surely something is deeply wrong with our society. American life expectancy dropped last year for the second year in a row. The first time it has done that in over 50 years. The biggest change in deaths that sort of impacted those numbers was from, quote unquote, unintentional injuries and suicides. The rise in unintentional injuries was due, says the Centers for Disease Control, to unintentional drug overdoses, opioids mostly. It is a commonplace now to worry, and worry a lot, about how large swaths of our country are seized by a kind of existential despair that gives rise to such deaths. Its causes are no doubt numerous: economic stress, family breakdown, social media, reality television, and so on. I've been claiming that reality TV would ruin our society for years, and but perhaps Harriet Vane's character suggests something else: our solitude, or maybe precisely our lack of community, our lack of real connection to others. Professor Jean Twenge published an article in the Atlantic Monthly that parents in my circle, and maybe people you know, have passed around and talked about a lot lately. Twenge noted that teen behaviors have shifted significantly over the last decade. Drug use, sexual activity, auto accidents, and the like have all fallen dramatically. But rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide have risen just as dramatically. The culprit, she suggests, is a smartphone, that handheld computer, phone, camera, television, all in one, that offers us the simulacra of connection without the real, physical, tangible presence of another human being. Perhaps one way to put it, and I don't know if Professor Twenge would put it this way, but I think Professor Colón would, is that we suffer, and Harriet Vane suffered, from a lack of genuine friendship. Yes, she lacked community, but I think it'd be more exact to say she lacked good or real community, but even be better to say that she lacked friends. Friends, as we learned, let us talk piffle, allow us to extend beyond ourselves, be silly, be valued, be known. When we think about why Harriet Vane has no joy, the most straightforward and maybe deepest answer is because she has no friends. Peter, of course, is just the opposite. He has friends all over the place, which is one of the reasons why I always found Harriet's rebuff so striking. Aside from criminals and other louts, who wouldn't want to be friends with Peter Wimsey? He's always up to one thing or another, he's tremendously generous and kind, and he just radiates an exuberance that is altogether childlike, in the best sense of the word. He takes joy in his work, and that joy draws quite the motley and deeply loyal crew to him. But as Professor Colón notes, he also is at times deeply melancholic. Through the full series of novels, we get hints that he carries serious psychological scars from his wartime service, and early on, I think before he meets Harriet, I think my memory is right, from a failed romance. But as Professor Colón points out, in these 4 novels, it is a struggle to reconcile himself to the criminal's justified punishment that is most pointedly at issue. He has, by uncovering their crimes, brought about their deaths. And that is, as it should be, a genuinely weighty thing. It is a credit, I think, to Peter's character that he recognizes the darker side of his chosen vocation. And it is a kind of vocation, indeed a political vocation at that. For what Peter is participating in is a core function of political authority, namely the punishment of criminals. Governments exist for no other reason than to restrain and punish wrongdoing. And what Peter seems to recognize is just how tragic that exercise of power actually is, even when it's exercised properly. Max Weber famously invoked the idea of vocation to describe the exercise of political authority, but Weber's conception was tragic all the way through. He owed too much to Nietzsche to believe that justice was anything more than convention. And so on his account, those who hold political office do so with the deep knowledge that they cannot ultimately justify it, but that it must still be done. It is simply necessary. This sense of politics as a tragic, unjustified, and necessary practice permeates our late modern or postmodern or whatever modern world we currently inhabit. Peter exemplifies, I think, something quite different. Something more akin to what Augustine offers in Book 19 of the City of God. In chapter 6 of that book, Augustine describes the dilemmas that inevitably faced judges in the ancient world. Namely, that the duties attendant to the ordinary exercise of their office inevitably required them to participate in terrible acts, to include torture and the execution of the innocent. Who would be a judge under these sorts of conditions? Augustine suggests that the wise man will, for, quote, society drags him to his duty. Augustine's dark lesson is clear. The social order without which we cannot live or flourish inevitably, inextricably requires terrible things, things which in ordinary life we simply do not permit and which none of us should easily endorse. Peter, I think, is in much this same position, inhabiting, if only informally, political office and sending men to their deaths on account of their wrongdoing. And like Augustine's judge, he feels compelled to continue, for his social order cannot endure absent the restraint of wrongdoing. But unlike, say, a Weber or a Hobbes or Machiavelli, it is not just necessity that drives Peter. For as with the torturing judge, he is not just wise. He is piously wise. He cries out in grief and loss and wants to be delivered from these necessities, to be relieved of this terrible vocation. Where is the joy in this? The exuberance, the childlikeness? It's tempting to say that it has no place. In some sense, I think that might be correct. Peter's melancholy is well earned and wise in its own way. But inasmuch as there are always those, hucksters and utopians, remember, who promise a political order without remainder, without tragedy, so too are also those, perhaps dystopians and hucksters of a different sort, who see nothing but tragedy, nothing but the gloom of power clashing against power in a forever twilight struggle. They are just as mistaken. For tragedy is not the end of the story, not with Harriet and Peter, nor with Augustine, nor with politics more broadly. Consider, what finally draws Harriet out of her despondency? It is the genuine, decent, peculiar, imperfect, and in some sense profoundly ordinary community in Oxford. Or maybe to put it a little bit more precisely, it is her friends in Oxford, and eventually Peter. There is a kind of politics in Oxford, and it must in the end punish the wrongdoer. That is a tragic, if proper, necessity. But it is also proper to say there's a kind of politics in Oxford, and it helps revive Harriet through her friendships and through her work. It is in a political community where she can recover her dignity, self-respect, and even capacity to love. To be altogether too quick about this, to eschew tragedy in our politics is to ignore what politics this side of the eschaton must do. It is to ignore the good grounds for Peter's melancholia. To suppose that tragedy is all it can do, that is to say, politics, all that politics can do, is to similarly ignore its possibilities and unreasonably eschew its crucial role in our flourishing. It is to try and do without hope. Augustine, after all, does not leave us with just the picture of the despondent judge or tragic politics, but notes it merely as an episode, a waypoint in God's redemption of all creation. Politics does not save, but neither does it just destroy. And we would do well in our age, when our political conceptions seem to veer wildly between these two poles, to recover a sense of political possibilities and limits. To gesture at something in closing, let me suggest a way to do some of that recovery. Friendship, I've intimated here, serves as kind of a linchpin for connecting joy and community. Civic friendship, the settled sense that we owe one another something, respect, esteem, consideration, something like the like, simply because we happen to belong to a common political community, might likewise serve as kind of a linchpin for navigating between tragedy and possibility. Civic friendship does not, should not, pretend to the same sort of goods appropriate to friendship proper. We are too disparate, too divided for that. But it might, properly understood, help us to see one another and see ourselves, as Harriet came to see herself again, as creatures lovingly made in the image of God, possessing an inviolate dignity, and fellow participants in the always imperfect, often fractious, and even tragic effort to form a common life here together. That is, I should say, not an especially high bar, and it certainly doesn't promise the sort of exuberant joy that makes Peter such an attractive character. But it's not so bad. And these days, that's nothing to sneeze at. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Bryan. That was wonderful, pulling all those threads together, and your mentions of friendship certainly reminded me of all our friends in the Sayre Society. There's something, I think, uniquely interesting about how Sayers does create friendships within those who read her. And the other thing that brought to mind was your mention of P.D. James. I don't know if you're aware that she made it very clear that she would probably have not become a detective writer apart from Dorothy Sayers, and became a close friend, connected to the Sayre Society, their patron, up until her death. So anyway, we now have the pleasure of asking questions of Dr. Colón and Dr. McGraw. So if you give us just one quick minute, we'll set up for the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess I get first crack at a question, and I'd read the text before and listened to it again. I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about how Sayers sees the relationship between joy and good work, because I think one of the interesting things that you do here in this lecture, as opposed to say the second and really kind of the first and second, is that, as you said at the beginning, you could listen to the first and second and think that Sayers was a bit of a kind of a workaholic, Everything's hard. You've got to kind of like stick to doctrine. You got to, and yet here you sort of want to say, well, no, this kind of completes the picture. But I'm curious to kind of go backwards and think about the kind of relationship between joy and excellent work.
Mm-hmm. I think for Sayers, there are a couple of different components. I think one would be that you found your vocation and your good work by the joy you can take in it. And in all aspects of it. Not to say that every single aspect of it will be wonderful. I mean, Sayers definitely has lots of complaining letters and, so not everything was joyful. But I think there was a sense that, if you find that vocation, you will experience that joy in it. So I think that's one important component. I think the other component is really the sense of when you're able to come together with others, and I think this is one of the reasons why she loved theater so much. When you come together with others, you can go through the really difficult work, but just take joy with each other. And so I love what Nora Lambourne says about how Sayers was the one who could always come into the workroom when everybody was stressed out, and she would know the right thing to say. Recognizing that you work better when you're able to be in that lighter, joyful mood than when you're consumed with all of the stress. And so I think for her, it's an important component because without it, it just becomes drudgery and you become bitter, and it allows you to keep going in that way.
Great, that's great. All right, so questions from the audience. I'm thinking my job is to facilitate those.
Thank you both. I really enjoyed that. I've been reading Gaudy Night because of these talks, and it struck me that as a transitional novel of her recovery, that the case itself of the poison pen, the fact of negative language and failure to have positive speech actually connects to, Bryan, what you were saying about civic friendship. How many poison pens do we have in the world today, right? Failure
tweets,
to right, and it's all and it's anonymous, a lot of it, and of course so just wanted to hear some comments on that.
No, now it's interesting. Now I'm running all the way down that path because I'm just thinking about, the various things that happen in that novel. You have the fact that some of the notes are actually put together from pages from newspapers, right? And so taking the press and putting them in there. You also have, wait, what was the other point I was going to make? There was another one there. You also have the destruction of other people's work, and going in and saying, no, that is bad, and so yeah, there is that element of just, I hadn't really thought as much about, how much use of good language, destruction of language is really a part of that novel.
Yeah, I'd say it's sort of the anonymity and the kind of the hiddenness of the sort of the poison pen, right? Certainly is kind of redolent of our own day. Other questions?
Only that it's a delight to hear you talk about the detective novels, just to hear somebody else unpack those, because we read them usually alone. So to have the community share that was really very special. Thank you.
You're welcome. That's why we need a detection club, We
I
can
do.
have
I think. You could put shades down. I don't know how much Wheaton would sort of think about skulls, lighting up the skulls.
There's got to be. There's some in the
the
anthropology room where we meet. Yeah.
And there's that weird Masonic building. You can appropriate that. That seems like appropriate.
Yes. And in case anyone's interested, the skull actually has a name. That's Eric the skull.
Eric.
Though, interestingly, Martin Edwards, who's the current president, says they did some testing and they discovered it should probably be Erica.
Oh. It's hard to tell.
I don't know Dorothy Sayers at all. I think I'll have to read her now.
Yes.
Oh, definitely.
But as you spoke, I was impressed with the way that she was genuflecting toward humility as she talked about the role of joy, Feifel, I think you called it, Fiffle, as she talked about the role of joy in helping be the glue of community, especially community in suffering, if I understood your points. And I'm wondering, did she ever tease out any more did the characters tease out any more the role of humility as a kind of underlying foundation for hope to be able to take root?
So she does definitely with the character of Peter Wimsey. One of the key components of his character as he develops in Gaudy Night, and he acknowledges this himself, is kind of having to come to a place of humility. And he actually takes some responsibility for the fact that Harriet does not immediately want to marry him by saying, he just thought, well, this is going to happen, and I get what I want, and so I will get this. And he actually says, I apologize for, just that continual pressure. And it's interesting because there's a moment in that novel where he suddenly has become very vulnerable. And Harriet is able to look at him and actually see that there is that possibility of connection. And so for me, I love that moment because it really conveys that sense of how do we really enter into friendship and community with someone. It's not by kind of putting up all of the sense of, okay, I'm fine, I'm perfect, I can get along with everything. But that humility that says, no, I'm broken as well. And that in the novel is what Harriet needs. She's broken. She needs to see that in someone else. And so I think for me, that's one of the places that I feel like Sayers really does show the value of that.
Thank you, Christine. It was wonderful. And also the wonderful respondent, too. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on how this idea of joy would apply to our own community. I think we're facing a lot of sort of crisis with higher education, and Oxford is wonderful, but we don't we are better than Oxford.
But we're not as rich as
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So do we need Oxford to? I mean, the Goth, all the privilege and the money and history that comes with it. And I was reminded because I used to be involved in a ministry for international students in Cambridge University, and some international students. I'm Japanese, so I talked to a lot of Japanese students, and they would actually accept Christ in Cambridge, but then it was also because of some of the beautiful architecture. And they go home back to Japan, and they see all the drab, sort of a really plain churches, and they don't, they just kind of stop there. There's just so much about the power of the setting, and it's difficult to maintain that sense of joy.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with the beautiful setting of Oxford. I mean, actually, one of my favorite things of doing Wheaton in England was actually reading Gaudy Night while I was in Oxford, because it was just, a lovely experience. But I do find it interesting that one of the problems that Shrewsbury College in Gaudy Night experiences, they're only a women's college. So they don't have the money and the power. And that becomes a running theme in the novel. And so it's interesting because as you were talking about, how do we here kind of have that sense of joy, I think we need more silliness and fun. And, as I've been doing these talks, I feel like we've got communities of action, right? We know how to go out and do something and, do something great for God and his kingdom. We've got communities of faith down, right? We know what that means. We're not so good at joy. And I don't think we're very good at joy in our community. I mean, I think we all have places where we go outside of the community for joy, but I don't think there are many opportunities for us to just get together and laugh and be silly and to know and to talk piffle, okay, with each other. We don't do that. I think we should do that. What do you think?
I agree. I think that the it might help if, in some sense, we didn't take ourselves so seriously, and also if we realized that it's it's okay not always to be doing something important. I mean, in a funny way, the sort of and I just speak from a faculty perspective here, I guess, but I think this sort of goes across a number of places. But the professionalization of the modern world is one in which everything has a kind of has a place, and you've got to be doing something always really important and forward moving in it, and not just, there's not space to do piffle or funny puns or I mean, my own department, and I'll brag on us a little bit. We did a little thing this afternoon where we had a conversation with some faculty and students on the politics of Wakanda from the movie Black Politics, and that's just pure fun, right? I mean, you're talking about a fictional country, right? That's not really, but it's just fun, and I think those things are very worthwhile, very worthwhile.
Thanks, both of you. This isn't really about joy. Well, maybe it is. But when I read Gaudy Night, I think about how different the academic world or academic, you were just touching on that, so I thought I would follow up on it. How different it is today from what I see, and the real theme, one of the real themes of Gaudy Night about intellectual integrity, and if you don't have that, you're not a real scholar. And just, can you free associate on that theme for a little bit?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things about those scholars is they're doing things that, I mean, honestly, does anybody really care about some, ancient history that you write something that maybe nobody reads and whatnot. Where our day is replete with lots of stories of people being willing to cut corners of one sort or another in order to kind of advance their professional career, right? They're all about making the next promotion or getting to the next thing or getting to the next grant or whatever it might be, right? I mean, anytime there's a particular sort of very important and controversial book, there's always, it gets a lot of attention, particularly sort of public attention. I always kind of worry, like, someone's gonna start reading those footnotes and see if everything is kind of exactly square. And I think part of that is just, it's this pressure to produce and to be successful, right? Which is counting your index, whatever that, I don't even know what this is, right? Index, the impact index in databases and whatnot, but it's always there.
Yeah, you're calling to mind when I first started in my PhD program, and there was all of this discussion about how well can you game the system and come up with the perfect dissertation topic that is going to set you up in 5, 6, 7 years down the line to get the perfect job. And that trying to manipulate the system so that you get the prestige that you need. And I worked on obscure 19th century women writers. I mean, I did it because I loved it, not because I thought it would actually get me a job, particularly because I was dealing with 3 Christian writers. So thank you, Wheaton, for hiring me, because I don't and honestly, that's why I work on Sayers, because I had fun with Sayers. I like detective fiction, and I felt like there's more going on in the detective fiction that needed to be talked about. And so, I think, just helping us all just kind of recover that sense of, do things because you love it. And
most people that go into our kind of business,
we do.
You start off doing that. I mean,
Right.
Nobody says, I want to go to graduate school because the
For money, right.
the glory, the
Right.
fame.
But once you're in, then it's like,
Yeah,
okay,
that's
how
all.
do I find that trajectory?
Everybody gets socialized.
Yeah.
That is the danger. I agree. I agree.
I don't really have a question, but I was just wondering if you could say anything about Mervyn Bunter.
Okay. So Bunter got cut because I was trying to do 4 novels and I couldn't deal with everything. But I actually love Bunter in Busman's Honeymoon. because when you're talking about community, there are these lovely exchanges. So one of the things that I tried to keep in but got cut because I was going way too long, in that opening section of Busman's Honeymoon where you get the different perspectives, he's writing a letter to his mother and he says, "We got married this morning." And so right from the beginning, he is part of that community, and he is essential at the end for actually bringing Peter back into community, you know. And I love the interactions between Harriet and Bunter because Harriet knows that he is part of the package. You know, she didn't just marry Peter; she married Peter and Bunter. And I love the fact that just their marriage has, you know, that more complex relationship and how they start to negotiate that in Busman's Honeymoon. So I was sad, but I had to cut Bunter.
Well, and in some sense, Bunter allows Peter to be kind of exuberant and childlike because he's there to sort of provide the backstop, right? To do all the kind of, and the same thing with the policeman Parker,
Yeah.
who also does all the kind of. In fact, it's Peter's oftentimes making jokes at him like, "Oh yeah, you do the hard work. I'm just gonna kind of flit around and then solve everything."
Right.
Thank you again to both of you. This is a delightful evening. Communities can be such a great foundation for joy, but at the same time, they're made up of people that are constantly changing and growing and moving. Of course, Dorothy was so good at correspondence, but how do you see her balancing being able to find joy in communities that are constantly changing and how exhausting it can be to try and make yourself vulnerable to a new group of people?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the word that stands out to me is exhausting because as I read through Sayre's correspondence, she had far more energy than I will ever have. I mean, her correspondence was just insane, and she just did such a great job at connecting with her friends while she was working on, 3 different projects. She used to put projects in different rooms of her house, so she'd go around and be doing different projects in different places. And so her energy just kind of, I find that astounding. But at the same time, I mean, she did, have situations where she kind of fell in and out of relationships with people, had to kind of renegotiate things with people, and in fact, in her own life, struggled in certain ways with elements of broken community. So I briefly mentioned, I didn't want to go into it in a lot of detail because it would have taken a lot of time, but the fact that she had a son that she kept as a secret. And from just about everybody. So she never told her parents. And there are heartbreaking moments in the letters where she recounts a visit that her mother made to her cousin who was actually fostering her son. And so her mother saw her grandson but didn't know it was her grandson. And so there are those elements of broken community that she had to kind of work through and deal with. In those ways. But in the midst of that, she was really able to, hold to the core of her relationships in ways that I find very admirable. So, yeah.
One more question?
I don't have a question, but just a request. I love that poem that you talked about at first, and as I pulled out paper and pen to copy it down, you went to the next slide. Would you pull that back up again so I can finish copying?
I think I can. Take me a while here. Backwards here. And a recap of the whole thing going backwards. Did you want the first stanza or the second? Because they're on 2 different slides.
In contemplation of sudden death. That one.
Yeah, I have 2 stanzas of that.
Oh, the first one.
Okay, first one. That's the second one. There's
coming, and we'll see you next year for Hansen with Jerry Root on the subject of Dimer, one of Lewis's poems. Thank you.
Great, thank you.